So here is a quick tour of my quarantine system. I am a long-time proponent of quarantining fish, although I have to confess that I don't actually quarantine inverts, though I probably should. I have a couple of, actually I have 3 quarantine tanks, only 2 of which really end up getting much use. This is the primary quarantine tank and the place where most fish go initially. It's a 20 long with kind of a basic light. It's got some pieces of PVC in it. As you move around the end, there's a sort of pretty standard hang on the back filter, a small heater, and also a small an older Jibo power head that hasn't failed yet. In the hang on the back filter, I put some pre-seeded biomedia, so I don't have to worry about ammonia, and so the tank is essentially cycled. I do keep a spare bag of media here, actually in the sump of my frag tank, which is connected to the main system. So I always have a reservoir of pre-seeded media should I find myself buying a fish that I didn't plan to buy, which unfortunately happens to be quite a bit since I have no 1 power. But so this is the main quarantine tank. The only thing that's a little different perhaps is I don't know how well you can see it. I have a standpipe installed in the side of this tank, and so one of the things that I do is when I get a new fish, I adjust the salinity of the tank to that of the incoming fish, right? So if it's a fish coming from live aquaria, not Diver's Den, but regular live aquaria, the salt level, the salinity is generally around 1.018, 1.017, and so I reduce the salinity of the tank here, or if I'm filling it from scratch, because if I have no fish in it, I do empty it and clean it. But if I'm receiving a new fish, I make sure that the salinity level of the tank is the same as the incoming water, and then I actually have the output, the old water of my automatic water change. I have that actually dripping into the quarantine tank. Because there's a standpipe in the tank can't overflow. But over the course of a couple of weeks, I'm able to get the salinity from, like I said, the initial 1.017-ish up to 1.025, which is what I keep my main tank at. So it's a nice and easy way both to minimize the stress on the fish initially, and also to get the salt level back up. You have to keep an eye on it. I have, on a couple of occasions, kind of forgotten that I've been running the old salt water into the quarantine, and when I've tested it, it was 1.03. So I'm like, oops. But that's the main quarantine tank. Has worked pretty well for me. I am not a particularly big fan of blasting new fish with a cocktail of meds. I much prefer an observational quarantine where I will use some nitrofuracin green powder initially. In all cases, it's really good at easing that initial acclimation of a fish. It's very good with ammonia burn, should there be any on your incoming fish. But that's it. I don't use copper proactively. I don't use chloroquine phosphate proactively. I only use it if symptoms present. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I've got a handful of dwarf angels, 4 in here, actually 3 flames and 1 ebly. They've been here a few days. So far so good. They're not eating much yet, but they're swimming around, and there's no observable problems with them. So this is my main quarantine tank. This is where most fish go initially. I do have a second tank on the other side of the sump room, which is what I've come to refer to as kind of my grow out quarantine tank. It's a little different than the other tank in that it's set up really as a proper miniature reef tank. So there's live rock in there. there's a sump underneath, and in the sump there's a small skimmer, and a few other things. This is, so if I get a couple of fish that are a bit on the small side, and I'm worried that they're gonna struggle in the main tank upstairs, you know, I'll put them in here and just feed them 5 or 6 times a day, get them, you know, to an acceptable size before I put them in the main tank. I've got a couple of nasos in here, a couple of small ones. They are in theory a blue spine and a flamingi. They'll both get quite large, but until they get a bit of size, I think you know, the precise species is is probably going to be a bit of a surprise. But we shall see. The other thing I do with this tank is, if I'm buying a fish that is particularly delicate or needs a sand base, a sand bed to do well, I will put them directly in here. So fish like leopard wrasses or something like a dwarf potter's angel, you know, would be fish that would go in here right out of the bag. I do keep this at 1.025, so that would require some salinity adjustment if in fact that fish is coming from a lower salinity source. Often I will buy leopard wrasses through Diver's Den, which is at 1.825 already, so the level of acclimation isn't really significant. I have a third quarantine tank up here, which frankly I almost never use. It was something that I put in when I was initially setting up my big tank, and I was running quite a few fish through quarantine. But now that I've mostly reached equilibrium with my fish population, I only add a few here and there. I don't need that third tank. In terms of medications, you know, I keep a number of things on hand. You can see a little bottle of Prazipro there for you know, worms, internal and external. I have a little jar of a little tub of chloroquine phosphate, which is proper chloroquine phosphate. There's a couple of things of the aforementioned nitrofuracin green powder, which I find helpful. There's some antibiotics back there. I think there's some fish flux, which is essentially Cipro. There's some Septra, which is a different kind of which is a different kind of antibiotic. And then I think there's some cupramine back there. Chloroquine phosphate is my go-to med for ick, for velvet, and for uronema. Although there are some fish like wrasses and you know, maybe even some kinds of anthias that may be a little sensitive to CP. So I do have cupramine back there. Cupramine will help with ick and velvet. It won't really do much for uronema. So if I get a fish that comes in with uronema, it's chloroquine phosphate or bust. So, you know, sometimes, I mean, uronema is tough. I probably have about a 50% survival rate for fish that exhibit the telltale body ulcerations of uronema. You know, whether the parasite kills them or the CP kills them, you know, who knows? But I know if I don't do anything, they're all toast. So that is my quarantine system. Probably probably a bit more than most people would undertake. But as I said, I have found that it works really pretty well for me, and I've been quarantining this way since since basically 2001. So hope this was helpful. If anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the thread. But this is what I do, and I'm sticking with it. Thanks.